In this video, I'm going to explain why I don't think the resurrection happened, and why you should be skeptical too. So here's an argument. If you're a nerd like me, you can pause the video and look it over, but it's really not necessary because the ideas it contains can be explained without putting it into a syllogism. I'm just trying to throw a bone to those of you who like everything stated out front and extremely clearly. Okay. So one of the first things that I think we should all be able to agree on is that if someone makes a claim, and that claim is initially improbable relative to our background knowledge, we should want strong evidence for believing it. Now, depending on what the claim is, one could try to argue that maybe the evidence needn't be strong if there are practical reasons for believing the claim, and that maybe that could even be rational. Whether something could be reasonable to believe, however you conceive of what that looks like, and whether or not something is true are separate questions. When you're evaluating whether something is true or false objectively, you should look for it to be more probable than not. So again, if that's what we're doing, and that is what we're doing in this video, we want strong evidence for improbable claims. As Michael Huemer puts it, quote, "The more probable the theory starts out, the more probable it ends up." Sort of like how the easiest way to become a millionaire is to start out with $999,999. This also supports the slogan, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," which basically means that if you have a hypothesis that is super implausible to begin with, then you're going to need a lot of evidence before it becomes believable. Whereas, if you started out with a plausible hypothesis, then you don't need as much evidence, unquote. Now, if you're allergic to the phrase, "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," just pretend he didn't say that. The point he's making stands regardless. If a claim has a low prior probability, that is, before looking at the evidence, the claim isn't likely to be true because it doesn't cohere well with our background knowledge, then we need strong evidence to believe it. Strong evidence being evidence that is better predicted by the wild claim hypothesis than by its alternatives, such that it is able to overcome the low prior. Let me use an example to help illustrate this. Suppose your friend believes that there are gremlins in his attic, and you ask, "Why should I believe that? I keep hearing weird noises coming from up there," he says. Now, maybe it's actually true that if there were gremlins up there, they would be making some noise. But weird noises could be explained just as easily by a lot of different things. And given our background knowledge of the world, any of those options are going to be more probable than a gremlin to explain that piece of data. So we've established something pretty general so far. That claims that are initially improbable relative to our background knowledge require strong evidence to be believed. The next step is to argue that miracles are just such things. I argue that they obviously are. To be more specific, a miracle in the sense that I mean it is anything that violates an extremely well-supported generalization about how nature operates. A generalization for which we basically have the strongest observational evidence we could expect to have. So, following the line of thinking we've been going along so far, miracles require strong evidence to be believed because, by definition, they are initially improbable relative to our background knowledge. Going a step further, the resurrection is a miracle claim, and so it follows that it requires strong evidence to be believed. This is just another way of saying that the resurrection has a low prior probability. In the same way that a specific version of theism can't be more initially probable than theism itself, so too a specific instance of a miracle claim can't be more initially probable than miracle claims in general. So again, the resurrection has a low prior probability. How low? I think it could be argued that it's very low. There are a few different ways to see this. The first is to introspect on your general experience of the world. If in every second of your life the world seems regular to you, then you're justified in assuming that's just the way it is unless you are presented with strong evidence to the contrary. Additionally, if your experience with the reliability of other people's testimony is hit or miss, and you're rightfully suspicious of religious testimony specifically, it's dubious whether testimony by itself should ever cut it. Regarding whether dead people can come back to life specifically, consider the fact that, quote, "a sample size of 1,000 is enough to guarantee that the overwhelming majority of possible samples are representative, regardless of how big the total population is. This is an a priori mathematical theorem," unquote, as Huemer notes. Take as many random samples of 1,000 people who have died in recent memory as you like, and you'll get a whopping 0% that have come back to life. Within recent memory is an important qualification, as we can actually check these things. So those samples are probably representative. So it's likely 0% of people have or ever will come back to life. The Christian might retort, well, yeah, that's if you leave God out of the picture. But if you don't believe in an agent that has the means and motivation to raise Jesus from the dead, then these initial considerations should be pretty decisive for setting the prior probability of the resurrection extremely low. This is why many apologists start with God and then proceed to argue for the resurrection, as it's actually incredibly difficult to overcome a sufficiently low prior, which atheists will no doubt rightfully have. But what if God exists? I agree that this does help, as there is now a deity capable and potentially willing to do something that seemed impossible before. But the question we should want to answer is, does this raise the prior significantly, or just give it a slight boost? I argue the latter. Why is this? Well, possibility doesn't equal probability. As Greg Cavin explains, quote, if God wills that I turn into a gigantic green cucumber, then indeed I will turn into a gigantic green cucumber. But it's very unlikely that God would will such a thing. The problem here is the fact that God can superintervene doesn't mean it's likely that he will. God's self-revelation through nature shows that he has an exceptionally strong tendency not to interfere supernaturally in the course of nature. We can see more specifically that God reveals every day in our everyday experience and in science that he possesses an exceptionally strong tendency not to supernaturally raise dead people from the dead. Unquote. I think this line of reasoning is completely obvious, and Christians who disagree are just putting the cart before the horse. As John Danaher explains, Christians tend to, quote, presuppose several Christian-specific beliefs in order to make the resurrection hypothesis seem more likely than it actually is. In other words, they tend to assume that the prior probability of the resurrection is quite high because God exists. Jesus was God's son, and there was a specific plan for salvation that involved Jesus' death and resurrection. Given those assumptions, then the observed minimal facts are quite likely, but that's reasoning in reverse. What we want to know is whether we should believe in the resurrection given the historical data, not whether the historical facts make sense given a bunch of prior Christian theological assumptions. Unquote. Let's move on from talking about the prior and into the nuts and bolts of how the resurrection is defended. Let's start with the minimal facts.
Number one would be that the tomb of Jesus, in which he was buried, was found empty on the first day of the week after his crucifixion by a group of his female followers. The second fact is that thereafter, different individuals and groups of people came to experience appearances of Jesus alive after his death, following his crucifixion. And then the third fact would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. The only question is, how do you best explain those three facts?
There are several different ways to push back against this. One obvious move is to call into question one or more of the facts presented, or at least challenge the way he is presenting them. But I want to do something a little bit different. I'm going to grant him the facts. He can have all the facts. It's going to be raining facts all up in here. His claim is that the probability of these facts given the resurrection is much higher than the probability of these facts given no resurrection. So much so that it can outweigh any initial skepticism one might have with a miracle claim like the resurrection.
What is the probability of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the origin of the Christian faith given the resurrection, compared to the probability of those facts given that Jesus did not rise from the dead? Well, I think that clearly the evidence is far, far more probable given the resurrection hypothesis. And that can serve to outbalance any improbability that you see in the event of the resurrection itself.
It's false. No way. Not this time. We created it. Not this time. No, not this time. It's totally made up. Pure fiction. It's fiction. It's fiction. We made it up. We made this one up. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication.
To restate Craig's claim again, what he's really saying is that if Jesus rose from the dead, then an empty tomb, individual and group appearances, the disciples suddenly and sincerely coming to believe that God raised him, etc., are exactly the kinds of things we would expect to see, while they are very surprising if no resurrection occurred. What I want to do here, again, is concede as much ground to Craig as I possibly can to illustrate my point. Let's say a resurrection predicts these facts extremely well, without quibbling over that too much. How surprising are these facts really if no resurrection occurred? Let's take them one at a time, starting with the empty tomb. If Jesus' body wasn't thrown into a mass grave, the most common thing that happened, how could a skeptic account for this fact? Pretty easily. The body was stolen by grave robbers. This was actually pretty common. Graves were robbed both to acquire wealth and for body parts to use for magical concoctions and recipes. Putting on his skeptic hat and entertaining this scenario, Dale Allison writes, quote, "No one ever came forward because the activity was illegal. For the same reason, they worked in the middle of the night so as to elude detection. And the stone was not rolled back into place because the uncaring robbers were in a hurry." Unquote. Really, fact number one boils down to a body went missing. Given what we've covered so far, why on earth would a resurrection be the best explanation for that? As to the appearances, while such things might fit well with the resurrection, it's not as uncommon as many think for people to report seeing recently deceased loved ones due to bereavement hallucinations. And it's just manifestly untrue that group appearances of various phenomena don't happen. Given the immediate context of a beloved religious leader being violently put to death and their body potentially going missing, that such things might occur isn't anywhere near out of the question. Plus, the main data we have for the group appearances is one guy saying a bunch of people saw something at once. Hardly a worldview-shattering piece of evidence. But again, why should we believe that a resurrection is probably what happened when we have perfectly reasonable and well-established mundane explanations that are much more likely? Finally, the disciples suddenly and sincerely coming to believe that God raised Jesus, again, seems to fit really well with the resurrection hypothesis. Why would we expect such things if no resurrection occurred? Well, it can be argued that the immediate religious context and basic human psychology doesn't make it that hard to believe.
While the beliefs and expectations of different apocalyptic groups can vary quite widely from one another, the same basic structure of this response has been observed again and again across many different religious and cultural lines. Whether we're looking at other Christian offshoots like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the followers of Harold Camping, or Jewish Messianic groups like the followers of Sabbatai Zevi or Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, in all these cases and many others besides, believers doubled down and found a way to turn an embarrassing disconfirmation into a mysterious and surprising partial fulfillment. So what does this all have to do with Christianity? Well, for one thing, based on what we can tell from the earliest sources, the situation of the disciples in the days after Jesus' death was very similar to that of the Millerites and other apocalyptic movements. They came to Jerusalem expecting the kingdom of God to appear immediately, a kingdom in which all the saints would be raised, the wicked would be judged, Jesus would be given authority over all the earth, and the disciples would rule by his side as representatives of the restored 12 tribes of Israel. But that didn't happen, and instead Jesus was captured and crucified by the same wicked authorities that the Messiah was supposed to overthrow. So the disciples were faced with the same alternative as other apocalyptic groups after the failure of their expectations. Either give up the cause completely, or find a creative way to adapt their expectations to reality while still maintaining the core of their faith. And as dissonance theory shows, this wasn't much of a choice. The belief that Jesus had been resurrected up to heaven allowed his followers to find a powerful new meaning in his death. It enabled them to turn the horror of his crucifixion into a paradoxical and mysterious messianic achievement, so that even the exact opposite of what they expected could be seen as a fulfillment of their larger kingdom expectations. It allowed them to take the very thing that seemed to disconfirm their beliefs, the biggest stumbling block and folly to outsiders, and boldly make that the cornerstone of their revised beliefs.
Hopefully you can see that there are options to explain the data available to skeptics that aren't completely out of left field. This is in part why the debate about the prior probability is so important. Because if it's very low, which I think it is, then if the skeptic can account for the data in a way that has some plausibility to it, It's going to be more probable than a miracle. The skeptic's account of the details would have to be completely crazy for that not to be the case. Maybe there will be a situation in the future where skeptical responses are even more wild than the miraculous claim being made. And in theory, that could happen. But that's clearly not the case here. As an illustration, look at this chart and think about the probability space as the surface area of this entire square. The x-axis represents the prior probability, and the y-axis represents the expectedness of the evidence given the competing hypotheses. Don't worry about numbers here, Bayes is basically geometry, so I can just show you what I'm saying. As you can see, I've given the resurrection a low prior and a high likelihood ratio, while no resurrection has a high prior and low likelihood ratio. Even if the minimal facts fit extremely well with a resurrection, if it has a low enough prior, then the negation of that hypothesis will still take up more probability space, even if it kinda sucks at predicting the data. I don't grant that it does. I'm just trying to show you why prior probability is so important. Again, it's not impossible to overcome a low prior. It would look something like this, where the alternative explanations are so improbable as to strain credulity. This is not the situation we find ourselves in with the resurrection, though. Sorry to say. People may think that I'm raising the evidential bar too high, as opposed to someone like Craig.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
But I don't think so. If I want to know what time it is, my standards are pretty low. I glance at my phone. If I were in a position where I was responsible for making sure a rocket is safe for launch, my standards would be exponentially higher. I would proceed with extreme caution and rigor. If we want to get to the truth about the sweeping claims that the Christian religion makes, I would submit we adopt something closer to the second attitude as opposed to the first. At the very least, I don't see how someone could be blamed for doing so. But there are other ways to defend the resurrection, a Christian might say. Instead of minimal facts, try maximal data. You could try to defend it this way, but it faces an uphill battle given what we know about the New Testament texts. To start, the Gospels were written decades after the events that they purport to describe, by people who were almost certainly not eyewitnesses. The notes in the New Oxford Annotated Bible put it rather starkly. Quote, "Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. They are not eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teaching." Unquote. Do those facts by themselves prove that there is no historical value to these texts? Of course not. But still, when people speak of the testimonial evidence we actually have in the Gospels as if it should persuade every rational person to believe that Jesus did the cha-cha across the Sea of Galilee, I often wonder if they're joking. Related, but still important.
Mark, Matthew, and Luke, on the other hand, tell most of the same stories, and they tell those stories in almost the exact same words. There are 661 verses in the Gospel of Mark. 600 of these appear verbatim in Matthew. Whatever your position, it is true 90% of Mark appears word for word in Matthew. The same is true of Luke, although in a slightly smaller scale. But a little over half of the Gospel of Mark shows up verbatim in the Gospel of Luke.
As crucial as this is for us to understand, many people just aren't aware that the Gospels aren't independent sources in any kind of traditional sense. Laura Robinson made this point forcefully when talking about J. Warner Wallace's detective shtick. Quote, "This is the kind of discussion of gospel relations I want to get popular readers of Christian literature to move past. These aren't 4 guys in 4 different interrogation rooms. They're 4 people, separated by several decades, reading each other's books. I have a feeling if Wallace had 4 witnesses in an interrogation room, read the first confession, and then read the second confession that contained 90% of the first confession, he'd find that pretty weird." Yes. That would be pretty weird. New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson summarizes the situation in this way. Quote, "The 4 Gospels are notoriously difficult to use as sources for reconstructing the historical Jesus. Their faith perspective, their literary interdependence, and the major and minor disagreements among them make a satisfying account of the events of Jesus' life impossible. The Gospels are severely limited as historical sources. unquote. Though we can know some things about the life of the historical Jesus, and perhaps disagree among ourselves about what we can and can't, the nature and features of the four Gospels do not lend themselves to any kind of unimpeachable case for Christianity. And, don't get my friend Ben started on Acts. What we have are theologically motivated texts that aren't actually independent sources, and they paint conflicting pictures of Jesus' life and teaching in addition to showing theological development over time. Christians with a conservative bent will no doubt bend over backwards to deny almost universally held consensus positions like these, and I offer them my sincere atheist thoughts and prayers. Trust me, if thoughts and prayers actually work, they'll need a prayer-answering deity to untangle them after they've twisted themselves into a pretzel, trying to smooth over data that conflicts with their paradigm. Oh, and before anyone accuses me of not going into the maximal data weeds, as promised, myself and a few others are still planning to review Lydia McGrew's newest book. The time is nearer now than when you first believed. That will be on the second channel that I recently started, where I interview people. So if you're interested in that channel, just search Non-Alchemist interviews. But before you do that, tap this video next to me and I'll share my deconversion story with you.